Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to The Other Side of History. In the history of the Reformation of the 16th century, Aubigne talks about a woman named Margaret. Now, Margaret was the Countess of Richmond and the grandmother of King Henry VIII of England. Margaret exercised an influence over the court of England in a very positive way. She had a passion for study, and the first 5 hours of her day, they were spent in reading and meditating upon the scriptures and in prayer. After that, she would move from her personal dwelling to another part of the palace, where she would dress the wounds of the sick. After that, she would go into the parlors, where there she would converse with the scholars of her day. Margaret had an influence over her son, the king, and her grandsons, who were Arthur and Henry, the same Henry who became King Henry VIII of England. Margaret was a constant correspondent and wise advisor to her son, the king. She was even given precedence over all of the other women of the royal family. And when her son died, she was the chief executor of the king's will. She also arranged her son's funeral and grandson's coronations. It was because of Margaret's influence and her love of study that men like Erasmus actually became a friend of the palace. It was Erasmus that was the man who restored the Greek New Testament from the uncorrupted manuscripts to Christianity. It was from Erasmus's Greek New Testament that our beloved King James Version of the Bible is based upon. Erasmus first met Henry when Henry was only 9 years old, and we are told that Henry charmed Erasmus. Erasmus kept up a friendly interaction with Henry and tried to take him under his wing, so to speak. It was Erasmus that saw Henry as an English diamond and hoped to help him to glitter with an even greater brilliancy, to use Erasmus's own words. However, Henry did not inherit his grandmother's true love of study, although she did encourage in him the finding of pleasure in the society of learned men. Erasmus had been given permission to move from the position of a monk to that of a scholar, and his work was to be in London. At London, he was heartily welcomed by Henry. With Erasmus and Henry, learning and power embraced each other. When Henry became King Henry VIII of England, it was said that the king could not live without the learned, and the learned could not live without Erasmus. In truth, Erasmus was the leader of learning at this time, and he was also an enthusiast or a fan of the young King Henry VIII. Erasmus, we are told, carried with him a little box in his pocket with a letter from King Henry. The letter expressed the tenderest regard for Erasmus. The friends of learning were hopeful that perhaps now there would be a spiritual reformation in Britain. Erasmus did do much for the Protestant cause by giving to Christianity the Word of God in its purity. It is the Protestant principle that the Word is above the Church, and that it is the Word that defines what the Church is. The Church of Rome said that the Church is above the Word, and it is the Church that defines what the Church is. The papal system was not happy with the scholars, which of course included Erasmus. And if they could not burn the scholars and the reformers, they wished for them at least to be banished. They said, if we do not stop this leak, it will sink the ship. Clergymen would dine with Englishmen after the dinner. They would then load them with lies about Erasmus and the other scholars. They called Erasmus a fox that was going to destroy the Lord's vineyard. Speaking of his work, Erasmus said, "If I told you what sweat it cost me," that is, in finding the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, "no one would believe me," end quote. As I already said, Erasmus was head of the literary community of his day, and his connections and correspondence, it extended all over Europe. Men like Tyndale said that it was because of Erasmus's Greek New Testament that he found Christ. Tyndale, he had an amazing gift for language, and he translated the Bible into English using Erasmus's Greek New Testament. Wycliffe had translated the Bible into English, but it was from the Latin Vulgate. Erasmus's Greek New Testament was from the received text. Wycliffe was actually ignorant of Greek and Hebrew, but it was nothing for him to shake off the dust which for ages had covered the Latin Vulgate Bible and to translate it into English. Wycliffe was a good Latin scholar and of a sound understanding and great penetration, but above all, he loved the Bible, and he understood it and desired to communicate this treasure to others. It took Wycliffe between 10 and 15 years to complete his task in translating. Learned men aided him with their advice. In 1380, the translation was complete. This was a great event in the religious history of England, who, outstripping the nations on the continent, took her station in the foremost rank in the great work of disseminating the scriptures. Margaret, the Countess of Richmond, King Henry VIII's grandmother, she lived from 1443 to 1509. Wycliffe's Bible had been in circulation for some time, and she loved the scriptures. Margaret was one of the most powerful women of her age because of a far too early marriage. There was far too early marriages back then. Margaret, she was only 13 years old when she gave birth to Henry Tudor, the father to Henry VIII. Now, as she was not yet physically mature, the birth was extremely difficult. And due to her age and the very difficult delivery, Margaret never conceived again. Margaret was married either 3 or 4 times, depending on whether the first one counts, as she did not count it as a marriage. Her first marriage was when she was just 1 year old. It was a marriage of words only, of course, and it was dissolved 3 years later. Margaret herself refused to acknowledge its validity and treated her second husband as her first. However, in terms of marriage contracts, her second husband was Sir Edmund Tudor, the first Earl of Richmond. She married him when she was 12, and he was 24. Margaret now became formally known as the Countess of Richmond, and she was soon pregnant with Edmund's child. Edmund died less than a year later when she was still pregnant with the future Henry VII. She married again to Sir Henry Stafford, but was then widowed again. Her last husband was Lord Stanley, who died in 1504. In her last 2 marriages, Margaret had an unusual degree of say in the choice of a husband, and seemed to have had a relationship of mutual respect with both of them. Henry VII was her only child. In Sir Henry Stafford's will, which is held in the National Archives, Margaret is named as his executor. He said that he entrusts Margaret to do for my soul according most after her discretion and wisdom. Margaret was a direct descendant of King Edward III's son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. John of Gaunt had been the friend and the protector of the reformer John Wycliffe. Whether true or not, Shakespeare portrayed John of Gaunt as an old, thin man in Richard II, thus popularizing the perception of Gaunt as being physically emaciated. Margaret was a fiercely loyal Lancastrian who, during the War of the Roses, was nonetheless smart enough to know when it was necessary to submit to Yorkshire rulers. It was called War of the Roses because the red rose was the emblem of the House of Lancaster, and the white rose belonged to the House of York. Margaret planned how to bring her son, Henry, the future King Henry VII, home from exile. Margaret had a strong bond with her son, and her life was devoted to his safety and success. Richard III had deprived Margaret of her lands, and she gave Henry both the encouragement and the ability to invade England and to overthrow Richard. Eventually, Margaret's son was made king, and Margaret's lands, they were restored. Margaret's influence and wealth, it was immense. She was able to get a status which gave her sole control over her property and finances. She was regarded as queen in all but in name. She was referred to as My Lady, the King's Mother. Margaret was a generous benefactor. She founded a number of educational establishments for the furtherance of religion. Margaret's personal involvement in managing her finances is shown by her signature at the foot of almost every page of her account books. Erasmus said, "I wish that even the weakest woman should read the Gospels, should read the Epistle of Paul, and I wish that they were translated into all languages, so that they might be read and understood." End of quote. His wish did come true for not only weak women, but powerful women like Margaret, who loved the Gospels. Today, most all are able to read God's holy word, and in their own language. Yet, how many Bibles just sit on the shelves? Power held by women in Margaret's day had their root in their relationship to men, deriving from roles as heiresses, wives, and mothers. However, Margaret's priorities, ambitions, desires, decisions, interests, and achievements, they were all hers. When circumstances caused her to lose her power and wealth, she found a way to regain it. Cambridge University honors Margaret's legacy with a symbol of the magnificent achievement of arms that is above the front gate of the college. Margaret learned to read and to write in English and in French. Her education, while certainly out of the reach of most women of the era, was not unusual for the heiress of a high noble. Her fondness for religious literature was evident throughout her lifetime. It was said that Margaret's grandson, Arthur, Henry's older brother, inherited his grandmother's looks. They say that they had a hooked nose, hooded eyes, and a slim build. Now, Margaret was said to be rather small and with a petite frame. Margaret died just 4 days after enjoying the coronation celebration of her grandson, King Henry VIII. Margaret was a kingmaker and has even been called the mother of the Tudor dynasty. Her resting place is at Westminster Abbey in London. There is a Latin inscription that was written by Erasmus on her tomb. Translates as Margaret of Richmond, mother of Henry VII, grandmother of Henry VIII, who gave a salary to 3 monks of this convent and founded a grammar school at Wimborne, and to a preacher throughout England, and to 2 interpreters of Scripture, one at Oxford and the other at Cambridge, where she likewise founded 2 colleges, one to Christ and the other to St. John, his disciple, end quote. So we can see how God used Margaret, King Henry VIII's grandmother, to influence the court and the schools of England. It seems that women of strength and perseverance, such as Margaret, will not be without their haters. Some have tried to attack her reputation. However, I believe that she was a godly woman who did much good for the cause of the Protestant Reformation in England. I hope that you have enjoyed this little talk. If you have, I would just encourage you to click on that subscribe button. I want to thank you for listening, and I'm wishing God's blessings to each one of you.